The rain came down like judgment from heaven, hammering the strip mall parking lot until the asphalt disappeared beneath sheets of silver water. Lightning split the Carolina sky, and thunder followed 3 seconds later, close enough to rattle the recruitment posters in the windows of the Marine Corps recruiting station. Inside, Sergeant Cody Vance looked up from his desk just in time to see the door swing open and bring the storm inside. The man who stumbled through that door looked like something the weather had dragged in and forgotten. His jacket hung open at one shoulder where the stitching had given up years ago. His boots, squelched with every step, held together by strips of duct tape, wrapped so many times they had become part of the leather itself. Water dripped from the brim of a hat that might have once been green, running down a face carved by 7 decades of sun and wind, and something deeper, something that had nothing to do with weather at all. Vance pushed back from his desk with a sound of disgust that carried across the reception area. 2 young men sat in the plastic chairs against the wall, potential recruits who had come in to discuss their futures, and now they watched with uncertain expressions as the old man stood dripping onto the polished floor. "This is not a homeless shelter," Vance announced, his voice loud enough to ensure everyone heard. He stood and straightened his uniform, making a show of the creases, the ribbons, the authority he believed those symbols contained. "We are a United States Marine Corps recruiting station, and I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The old man did not move toward the chairs. He did not move toward the coffee station in the corner or the bathroom down the short hallway. He simply stood near the door, hands hanging at his sides, and when he spoke his voice came out rough and quiet, the voice of someone who had not used it much lately. "Just the storm," he said. "Just waiting out the storm, Sergeant. I will stand right here. Will not touch anything. Will not bother anyone." Vance laughed, a sharp performative sound designed for his audience. He gestured at the puddle forming around the old man's boots. "You're already bothering everyone. You're dripping on my floor. You smell like you have not seen a shower since the Clinton administration." And frankly, he turned to wink at the recruits. "You are not exactly the image we want representing the few and the proud." The recruits laughed, but it was nervous laughter, the kind that comes when you're not sure if you're supposed to find something funny. One of them, a kid with a community college sweatshirt, shifted in his seat and looked away. Behind the front desk, Lance Corporal Diana Reyes watched the exchange with her fingers frozen over her keyboard. Something about the old man's posture made her uncomfortable in a way she could not name. The way he stood, feet shoulder-width apart, weight balanced, even soaking wet and clearly exhausted, he stood like someone who had been taught to stand and had never forgotten the lesson. Staff Sergeant William Chun emerged from the back office with a folder in his hand and stopped when he saw the scene unfolding. His eyes moved from Vance to the old man and back again, and something flickered across his face, but he said nothing. He simply leaned against the doorframe and watched. Vance was enjoying himself now. He had an audience, a target, and nothing better to do while the storm raged outside and kept any real prospects from walking in. He circled around his desk and approached the old man, close enough to make a point, but not close enough to get wet. "Let me guess," Vance said, crossing his arms. "You serve, right?" They all say they served. Every guy on every street corner with a cardboard sign. They all did 3 tours and saved the president and won the war single-handed. He shook his head with theatrical disappointment. "You know what I see when I look at you? I see someone who cannot hack it. Someone who gave up on themselves and now expects the rest of us to feel sorry for them." The old man said nothing. His eyes, gray as the storm outside, moved slowly across the room. They tracked the exits. They noted the positions of every person present. They lingered for a moment on the table against the far wall, where rifle components lay spread across a dark cloth, an M16 disassembled for the demonstration Vance had been giving the recruits before the interruption. His fingers twitched at his sides. A small movement, almost invisible, but Reyes saw it. She saw the way his hands seemed to move of their own accord, performing some invisible sequence in the air beside his thighs. If you're watching this story unfold from anywhere in the world, we would love to know where you're joining us from today. Drop a comment below and tell us your city or country. And remember, Hidden heroes walk among us in every community. The man standing next to you at the grocery store, the woman sitting alone in the park, they might carry stories that would bring you to your knees. If tales of courage and redemption speak to you, consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us share these incredible stories that honor the forgotten among us. Now, let us continue with what happened next in that recruiting station, because Sergeant Vance had no idea what he had just dragged in from the storm. The old man's gaze returned to Vance and held there, steady and patient as stone. With respect, Sergeant, he said, I asked for nothing but a dry spot to stand. The thunder rolled outside, rattling the windows. I have stood in worse places than this. I can stand a little longer. Something in those words made Chin straighten against the doorframe. Something in the way they were delivered, flat and factual, and completely without self-pity, made the staff sergeant set down his folder and pay closer attention. But Vance heard nothing but an opportunity. He smiled the smile of a man who had found his entertainment for the afternoon, and in exactly 47 minutes, that smile would be wiped from his face so completely that he would spend the rest of his career trying to earn it back. But he did not know that yet. None of them knew what had just walked in from the rain. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting their pale glow across the recruiting station while rain continued to hammer the windows. The old man had not moved from his spot near the door. Water still dripped from his clothes, but slower now, the puddle beneath his boots spreading no further. He stood with the patience of someone who had learned long ago that time moved differently when you stopped fighting it. Vance had returned to his desk, but kept glancing over, unable to let the intrusion go. The two recruits whispered to each other, stealing looks at the strange figure by the door. Lance Corporal Reyes pretended to focus on her computer screen, but her eyes kept drifting back to those hands, those fingers that moved in small patterns even when the rest of him stood perfectly still. The old man's mind was not in the recruiting station. It was 53 years in the past, standing in a different kind of rain on the other side of the world. Quantico, Virginia. Summer of 1971. A young Marine named Elwood Tatum stood at a workbench in the armory while senior instructors gathered behind him. His hands moved over rifle components with a speed that made the observers lean forward, trying to track the movements, trying to understand what they were seeing. The M14 came together in his grip like it was assembling itself, each piece finding its home with a precision that bordered on the mechanical. "Where did you learn that?" one of the instructors had asked. Tatum had looked up from the completed rifle with genuine confusion. "Learn what, gunnery sergeant?" "That grip sequence. That transition between the bolt carrier and the receiver. I have been teaching weapons assembly for 11 years, and I have never seen anyone do it that way." Tatum had looked down at his hands like they belonged to someone else. He could not explain it. The movements came from somewhere deeper than thought, somewhere in the wiring between his brain and his fingers that had been soldered together through 10,000 hours of repetition. His father had been a gunsmith in rural Tennessee, and Elwood had grown up with rifle components scattered across the kitchen table like other children grew up with building blocks. "It just makes sense," he had said. "The angles, the leverage. You lose a half second every time you adjust your grip. Why adjust when you can sequence?" The instructors had looked at each other. Within a month, they were studying his techniques. Within a year, they were teaching them. Within a decade, they would be called the Tatum sequence, and every sniper instructor at Quantico would learn them as gospel. But that was before Vietnam, before Teddy, before everything that mattered got stripped away one piece at a time until all that remained was an old man standing in a puddle in a strip mall recruiting station, watching a young sergeant who had no idea what he was looking at. The memory shifted. Jungle heat, rain that fell warm as blood. Corporal Theodore Birch crouched beside him in the undergrowth, eyes scanning the tree-line while Tatum adjusted his scope. Teddy had been 22 years old with a wife back in Oklahoma and a baby girl he had never met. He talked about that baby constantly, showed the photograph so many times that Tatum had memorized every detail of that tiny face. Teddy was going to teach her to fish, going to take her to see the Grand Canyon, going to be the father his own father never was. "You know what I think?" Iron Hand, Teddy had whispered that day in the jungle, using the nickname the platoon had given Tatum. I think when we get home, you should come visit. Margaret would love to meet the man who keeps saving my sorry hide. And my little girl needs to know the best Marine I ever served with. Tatum had smiled without taking his eye from the scope. You just want free babysitting so you could take your wife dancing. Teddy's laugh had been soft, barely a breath, but genuine. Caught me. But seriously, brother, you and Margaret would get along. She appreciates a man with steady hands. Thunder crashed outside the recruiting station, dragging the old man back to the present. His hands had stopped their invisible movements. They hung still at his sides now, trembling slightly, though not from cold or age. They trembled because they remembered. They remembered the weight of Teddy in his arms 3 hours after that conversation. They remembered the blood soaking into his uniform. They remembered the way Teddy's eyes had focused on his face with terrible clarity in those final seconds. Not your fault, Teddy had said, his voice already fading. Not your fault, brother. The scope needed adjusting. You did your job. I did mine. That is how it works. But Tatum had seen the enemy sniper in his peripheral vision, had seen the rifle barrel emerge from the window they had cleared twice, had turned a half-second too late because his hands were on the scope instead of on his trigger. Teddy had taken the round meant for him. Teddy had died in the mud with his photograph of a baby girl pressed against his chest because Tatum had been too slow. The official report called it unavoidable combat loss. The medals they pinned on Tatum's chest called him a hero for the 17 confirmed kills he made in the following 6 hours, hunting the enemy cell through the jungle with a precision that terrified even his own commanders. But Tatum knew the truth. He knew that the greatest shot he ever failed to make was the one that would have saved his brother. He never went to Oklahoma, never met Margaret, never held that baby girl. He sent money when he could, letters when he found the words, but he could not look Teddy's family in the eye, could not sit at their table and pretend he deserved to be there when Teddy's chair sat empty. So he did what Teddy asked instead. He taught. He poured everything he knew into the next generation and the generation after that. He built something that would outlast him, a legacy written in grip sequences and assembly techniques and the steady hands of Marines who never knew where their training came from. And then Margaret died. Not Teddy's Margaret, but his own. The woman who had waited at windows and held him through nightmares and convinced him that surviving was not a betrayal. The woman who had given him a daughter and a reason to believe that life could be more than penance. Cancer took her in 11 months, and when she was gone, the house became a museum of everything he had lost. Every photograph was a wound. Every empty chair was an accusation. His daughter Elena had her mother's eyes, and looking into them felt like drowning. So he left. He wrote a note that said, "I love you, and I am sorry, and live your life, and do not look for me." And he walked out into a world that had no use for an old Marine with steady hands and a broken heart. Staff Sergeant Chun cleared his throat, snapping the present back into focus. "Vance," he said, "maybe we should just let the man wait out the storm. It is not hurting anything." Vance turned in his chair with an expression of theatrical offense. "Not hurting anything? Look at him, Chun. Look at what he is doing to the image we are trying to project here. How am I supposed to sell these kids on becoming Marines when this is what they see? The failure? The end point?" The old man heard every word. His expression did not change. His hands resumed their subtle movements at his sides, fingers tracing patterns in the air that no one else could see. Patterns that had been burned into his muscle memory so deeply that even 50 years of grief could not erase them. He was not looking at Vance anymore. He was looking at the table, at the M16 laid out in pieces on the dark cloth, at the components waiting to become whole again. And somewhere deep in the wiring between his brain and his fingers, something stirred. Vance was not finished. Men like Vance were never finished when they sensed weakness, when they believed they had found someone who would not fight back. He pushed away from his desk again and walked toward the demonstration table, positioning himself between the old man and the disassembled rifle like a showman preparing his next act. "Now," he announced to the recruits, "before we were so rudely interrupted by the weather and its refugees, I was showing you gentlemen something important. He gestured at the components spread across the dark cloth. This is what separates Marines from civilians. The ability to take chaos and create order. To take pieces and make them whole. To build something that works. He picked up the lower receiver and held it toward the light, turning it so the recruits could see. This rifle is your lifeline. In combat, it is the difference between coming home and coming home in a box. Every Marine learns to assemble and disassemble their weapon until they can do it blindfolded, until their hands know the work, even when their mind is occupied with staying alive. The old man watched. His eyes tracked each component as Vance pointed to it. The buffer tube, the charging handle, the bolt carrier group, the firing pin. Each piece had a place, a purpose, a precise relationship to every other piece. He knew those relationships the way he knew his own heartbeat, the way he knew the sound of Teddy's laugh, the way he knew the smell of Margaret's hair after she washed it with that lavender shampoo she loved. Vance caught him watching and smiled. The smile of a predator who had spotted movement in the tall grass. Something interesting over here, old-timer. Vance set down the receiver and turned to face him fully. You keep staring at this table like you have seen a rifle before. Maybe on television? Maybe in one of those war movies where everybody comes home a hero. The recruits shifted in their seats. The one in the community college sweatshirt looked actively uncomfortable now, his eyes darting between Vance and the door like he was calculating his escape route. His companion, a broader kid with a high school football jacket, seemed more entertained, leaning forward with the eager expression of someone watching a fight develop. Lance Corporal Reyes stood from her desk. "Sergeant Vance," she said, her voice careful and measured. "Maybe we should get back to the presentation. The storm looks like it might be letting up soon." Vance waved her off without looking. "Relax, Reyes. I'm making a point here. A teaching moment." He turned back to the old man. "You see, gentlemen, this is what happens when you do not have discipline, when you do not have structure, when you let yourself fall apart." He gestured at the old man's torn jacket, his taped boots, the water still darkening the floor around him. This is the alternative to excellence. This is what giving up looks like. The old man's jaw tightened. A small movement, barely perceptible, but Reyes saw it. Shin saw it too, straightening slightly in the doorway of the back office where he had been pretending to read his folder. "I have not given up," the old man said quietly. Vance laughed. "No? Then what do you call this?" He spread his arms wide, encompassing the old man's entire existence with a gesture. "What do you call standing in a puddle in a recruiting station begging for shelter? What do you call those boots? That jacket? The fact that you clearly have not had a hot meal or a real bed in God knows how long?" "I call it Tuesday," the old man said. The words landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Simple, factual, completely without self-pity or performance. Just a statement of reality from someone who had learned to accept reality a long time ago. For a moment, Vance seemed unsure how to respond. Then his eyes narrowed and his smile returned, sharper now, edged with something that looked almost like anger. He did not like being caught off balance. Did not like jokes he had not made himself. "Tuesday," he repeated. "That is cute. Real cute." He walked closer to the old man, close enough that he had to look up slightly to meet those gray eyes. "Tell me something. You keep staring at that rifle. You keep watching my hands like you know something. So what is the story? You cleaned one once? Maybe saw a buddy do it back in whatever war you were pretending you fought in?" The old man did not step back, did not flinch, did not break eye contact. "Vietnam," he said. 2 tours. Then 31 years at Quantico. Vance's laugh was loud enough to echo off the walls. "Quantico." He turned to share his amusement with the recruits. "Did you hear that, gentlemen? We have got a Quantico Marine here. 31 years, no less." He turned back, shaking his head. "Let me guess. You were a general. No, wait, you ran the whole place. Probably trained every Marine who ever lived." The old man said nothing. His hands had gone still at his sides. Completely still. The subtle movements that Reyes had been watching all afternoon had stopped entirely, and somehow that stillness was more unsettling than the movement had been. Staff Sergeant Shin set down his folder and took a step into the main room. "Vance," he said, his tone carrying a warning that Vance either did not hear or chose to ignore. That is enough. But Vance was committed now. He had an audience and a target and the bit between his teeth. He leaned closer to the old man, close enough to smell the rain and the streets and the years of hard living that clung to those worn clothes. "You want to know what I think?" Vance said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur that still carried through the quiet room. "I think you're a liar. I think you never served a day in your life. I think you memorize some terms from a documentary, and you use them to squeeze sympathy out of people who do not know any better." He straightened and raised his voice again, playing to his audience. "I have seen 100 guys like you. 1,000. Every street corner in America has some bum with a cardboard sign claiming he took a hill or saved a battalion or whatever story gets the most quarters in his cup." Lightning flashed outside, bright enough to bleach the color from the room for a split second. Thunder followed immediately, shaking the windows in their frames. The old man looked at Vance for a long moment. Then his eyes moved past the sergeant to the table behind him, to the rifle components waiting on their dark cloth, to the pieces that his hands knew better than they knew anything else in the world. And when he spoke, his voice had changed. It was still quiet, still rough from disuse, but there was something underneath it now. Something that made Reyes take an involuntary step backward. Something that made Chen's hand drift toward his phone. "You want proof?" the old man said. It was not a question. Vance heard the change in the old man's voice, but misread it entirely. He heard challenge where there was only weariness. He heard bluff where there was only truth waiting to surface. 26 years old with one deployment under his belt and a chest full of assumptions, Sergeant Cody Vance had no framework for understanding what stood before him. "Proof," Vance repeated, crossing his arms and leaning back on his heels. "Sure, old-timer. Show me some proof. What have you got? A VFW card you bought at a flea market? Some dog tags you found in a pawn shop?" The old man's hand moved to his chest. Slowly, deliberately, he reached beneath the layers of damp clothing and withdrew a chain. 2 tags hung from it, metal worn smooth by decades against skin, the stamped letters barely visible under the fluorescent lights. He did not remove them. He simply held them out, letting them hang in the space between himself and Vance. "Tatum El Wuji." The old man recited the information without looking at the tags. 217-48-9156. "Oh, positive. Catholic. United States Marine Corps." Vance squinted at the tags, then shrugged with elaborate disinterest. "Like I said, pawn shop special. You could buy those anywhere. Probably belonged to some real Marine before you got your hands on them." The old man let the tags fall back against his chest. His eyes had not left Vance's face. There was no anger in them, no offense at the accusation. There was something else there, something that looked almost like pity. "The other tags," the old man said quietly. "The ones underneath. Those belonged to Corporal Theodore Birch. Serial number 218-52-7743. B negative. Baptist. He died in my arms in Quang Tri Province on March 19, 1972. He was 22 years old, and he had a daughter he never met." The room had gone quiet. Even Vance seemed momentarily uncertain, his confident posture faltering for just a heartbeat before he recovered. "Nice story," Vance said, but his voice had lost some of its edge. "Very touching. You practiced that much?" Staff Sergeant Chen stepped fully into the room now. "Vance," he said again, and this time the warning was unmistakable. "I said that is enough." Vance turned to him with an expression of wounded innocence. "What? I'm supposed to just believe every sob story that walks through the door? You know how many times I have heard this routine? They all have tags. They all have dead buddies. It is the oldest con in the book." The old man watched this exchange without expression. His mind had already begun to drift again, pulled backward by the weight of the names he had just spoken aloud. Names he whispered to himself every morning when he woke beneath whatever overpass or doorway had sheltered him through the night. Names that kept him company during the long hours when the streets emptied and the darkness pressed close. Teddy had been afraid of the dark as a child. He had confessed this one night in the jungle, both of them unable to sleep, the sounds of the war distant but never quite gone. His voice had been sheepish, embarrassed, the voice of a young man admitting weakness to someone he respected. "I know it is stupid," Teddy had said. "I am a Marine, for crying out loud. I have shot men. I have been shot at. But sometimes when the lights go out, I am right back in that closet where my old man used to lock me when I misbehaved. 5 years old, sitting in the dark, waiting for morning." Tatum had not laughed, had not judged. He had simply reached into his pack and pulled out a small flashlight, pressing it into Teddy's hands. "Keep it," he had said. "Light weighs nothing. And fear is not weakness, Corporal. Fear is information. It tells you what matters enough to be afraid of losing." Teddy had kept that flashlight until the day he died. It was in his pocket when they loaded his body onto the helicopter. Tatum had watched it go, watched the last piece of his brother disappear into the sky, and he had never spoken about the dark again. Now he stood in the artificial brightness of a recruiting station, watching a young sergeant perform outrage for an audience that was growing increasingly uncomfortable. The recruit in the football jacket had stopped smiling. His companion in the community college sweatshirt had pulled out his phone and was holding in his lap, though whether to record or to call someone was unclear. Lance Corporal Reyes had moved closer to Chun, positioning herself near the back office door. Her eyes kept moving between Vance and the old man, calculating, assessing. She was young, but she was not stupid. She could feel the pressure building in the room, like the pressure before a thunderclap. "You want to know what Quantico taught me?" the old man said, and his voice cut through the tension like a blade through cloth. It did not rise in volume. It did not need to. Vance turned back to him, ready with another dismissal, another joke, another performance. But something in the old man's posture made the words die in his throat. The old man had changed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. His shoulders had squared. His spine had straightened. The weariness that had seemed to hang from him, like his wet clothes, was still present. But there was something underneath it now. Something solid. Something that had been forged in jungles and rifle ranges in 31 years of turning raw recruits into precision instruments. "Quantico taught me," the old man continued, "that every rifle has a voice, a personality. You learn to listen to that voice, to work with it instead of against it, and the weapon becomes an extension of your own hands." He paused, his gray eyes fixed on Vance with an intensity that made the sergeant take an involuntary step backward. "I spent 3 decades teaching young Marines to hear that voice. I watched them arrive as boys and leave as something else. Something forged. Something capable." His hands had begun to move again at his sides. Not the subtle twitching from before, but deliberate movements now. Controlled. Each finger finding its position in an invisible sequence. "I watched some of them die," he said. His voice did not waver. "I carried their letters home to their families. I stood at their graves and promised them that their sacrifice would mean something, that I would keep teaching, keep forging, keep building the next generation until there was nothing left of me to give." He took a step toward Vance, and the sergeant held his ground, but only barely. And when there was nothing left, the old man said, "When I had given everything to the Corps, and then given everything to a woman who made the giving worthwhile, and when she was taken from me too, I walked away. I did not ask for anything then, and I am not asking for anything now. Just a dry place to stand while the storm passes. That is all I have ever needed. That is all I am asking for." The silence that followed was so complete that the rain on the windows sounded like applause. The moment stretched like a wire pulled too tight. Vance stood frozen between the old man and the demonstration table, his confident smirk struggling to hold its shape. Behind him, the rifle components waited on their dark cloth like pieces of a puzzle that had been waiting 50 years to be solved. Staff Sergeant Chun broke the silence. He cleared his throat and took another step into the room, positioning himself closer to Vance, close enough to intervene if things escalated further than words. "I think we have all made our points," Chun said carefully. "The storm is letting up. Maybe we should just let this gentleman be on his way and get back to business." But Vance had heard the challenge in the old man's words, and he could not let it go unanswered. His pride had been pricked, his authority questioned in front of potential recruits, and men like Vance needed to have the last word the way other men needed oxygen. "Hold on," Vance said, holding up a hand to stop Chen's approach. "Hold on a second." He turned back to the old man, and there was something new in his eyes now, something that had moved beyond performance into genuine confrontation. "You said Quantico taught you about rifles. You said you spent 30 years teaching Marines." He gestured at the table behind him. "So prove it." Chen's jaw tightened. "Vance, this is not appropriate." "No," Vance continued, warming to his idea. "This is perfect. This is exactly appropriate. He wants to stand in my station and make claims about his service. He wants to talk about forging Marines and hearing the voice of rifles." He turned to face the old man fully, spreading his arms wide. "Then let us see it. Right here, right now. Show me what 30 years at Quantico looks like." The old man did not respond immediately. His eyes moved past Vance to the table, to the components spread across the cloth. The lower receiver, the upper receiver, the bolt carrier group, the charging handle, the buffer tube and spring, the pistol grip, the trigger assembly, each piece familiar as his own reflection. More familiar, perhaps. He had not looked in a mirror in years, but he had held these components in his hands 10,000 times. "I'm not here to prove anything," he said quietly. Vance laughed, but there was an edge to it now. "Of course you're not. Because you cannot. Because everything you just said was a story you made up to get sympathy, to make us feel bad for the poor, homeless veteran routine you have been running." Lance Corporal Reyes spoke up from her position near the back office. "Sergeant Vance," she said, "I really think we should just let this go." Vance ignored her. He walked to the table and swept his hand across the components, making them rattle against each other. 60 seconds, he announced. "That is what I give my recruits on their first try. 60 seconds to assemble a standard M16 from these components." He turned back to the old man with a grin that showed too many teeth. "You want to prove you are who you say you are? Beat 60 seconds. Should be nothing for a master instructor from Quantico, right?" The recruit in the community college sweatshirt shifted uncomfortably. "This feels wrong," he muttered to his companion. The football jacket kid just shrugged, but his entertainment had curdled into something more uneasy. He kept glancing at the door, like he was calculating whether he could leave without making a scene. Chen tried one more time. "Sergeant Vance, I am ordering you to stand down. This has gone far enough." Vance turned on him with surprising heat. "With respect, Staff Sergeant, I'm trying to expose a fraud here. Do you know how many real veterans get disrespected because of guys like this? Guys who wear the uniform without earning it? Who claim the service without sacrifice?" He jabbed a finger toward the old man. "If he is who he says he is, this should be easy. And if he is not, then we have done every actual Marina service by calling out another stolen valor case." The words hung in the air. Stolen valor. The accusation that cut deeper than any insult, deeper than any mockery of his appearance or circumstances. The suggestion that he had not earned what he carried, had not bled for what he knew, had not buried enough brothers to fill a cemetery with his grief. The old man's hands stopped moving at his sides. For a long moment, he simply stood there, water still dripping occasionally from his clothes, gray eyes fixed on the young sergeant who had no idea what he was asking for. Then something shifted in his face. Not anger, not offense. Something older than that. Something that looked almost like resignation, or perhaps acceptance. The expression of a man who had spent 7 years avoiding mirrors and memories, who had walked away from everything he built because the building had become unbearable, and who now found himself standing in front of a table that held all the pieces of who he used to be. 60 seconds, the old man repeated. "That is right," Vance said, crossing his arms with satisfaction. 60 seconds. Standard time for a first attempt recruit. Should be nothing for a master instructor. The old man nodded slowly. Then he began to walk toward the table. Every eye in the room followed him. Reyes had her hand on her phone now, though she had not yet raised it. Chen had gone very still, watching with an expression that suggested he was beginning to suspect what Vance could not imagine. Even the two recruits had stopped their whispered conversation, drawn forward in their seats by the gravity of the moment. The old man stopped at the edge of the table. He looked down at the components spread before him, and for just a moment, his weathered face softened into something that might have been fondness. The expression a man might wear when reuniting with an old friend he had not seen in years. The expression of recognition, of homecoming, of hands remembering what the heart had tried to forget. He reached for the first component, and then his hands began to move. What happened next would be talked about in that recruiting station for years. It would be described and redescribed, analyzed and debated, until it took on the quality of legend. But for those who were there, for those who watched it happen in real time, there were no words adequate to capture what they witnessed. The old man's hands did not move like old hands. They did not tremble or hesitate or search for the next component. They moved like water finding its course downhill, like a bird finding its path through familiar sky. They moved with a certainty that transcended thought, that bypassed consciousness entirely and operated on some deeper level of knowing that had been carved into muscle and tendon and bone across 30 years of repetition. His right hand found the lower receiver, while his left was already reaching for the pistol grip. The two components came together with a soft click that seemed to echo in the silent room. Before the sound had faded, his fingers were moving again, threading the grip screw with a rotation so precise it might have been measured with instruments. Vance had started a timer on his phone when the old man reached for the first component. He held it now in front of him, watching the seconds tick upward, his smirk firmly in place. 15 seconds, and the old man was still working. This was going to be embarrassing, just as he had predicted. This was going to prove everything he had been saying. But Lance Corporal Reyes was not watching the timer. She was watching the hands, and what she saw made her breath catch in her throat. The old man was not assembling the rifle the way she had been taught. He was not following the standard sequence that every Marine learned in basic training, the sequence that had been drilled into her until she could perform it in her sleep. He was doing something else entirely. His hands moved in patterns she did not recognize, grip positions she had never seen, transitions between components that seemed to skip steps she had been told were mandatory. And he was fast, impossibly, unbelievably fast. The buffer tube slid into place. The buffer spring followed, seated with a single precise motion. The stock locked on with a click that sounded almost musical. 22 seconds had passed, and the lower receiver was complete, assembled with a speed that made Reyes's own best time look like slow motion. Staff Sergeant Chun had stopped breathing. He stood frozen in the middle of the room, his forgotten folder hanging limp in his hand, his eyes fixed on the table with an expression of dawning recognition. He had seen fast assembly before. He had trained Marines who could break down and rebuild their weapons with impressive speed. But he had never seen anything like this. He had never seen hands that moved with this kind of authority, this kind of absolute certainty. The old man did not look up. His eyes stayed fixed on the components before him, but there was no searching in his gaze. He knew where everything was. He knew where everything needed to go. His hands were simply executing a program that had been written into them so long ago that the original coding had become indistinguishable from instinct. The upper receiver came next. The bolt carrier group slid home with a sound like a key turning in a lock. The charging handle seated itself with a snap that made the recruit in the football jacket flinch. 31 seconds. 32. The old man's hands never paused, never hesitated, never made a single wasted motion. Vance's smirk had begun to falter. He looked down at his timer, then back up at the table, then down again. The numbers did not make sense. The speed did not make sense. Nothing about what he was seeing matched his expectations. And for the first time since the old man walked through the door, Sergeant Cody Vance felt the cold finger of doubt trace its way down his spine. The firing pin seated. The cam pin locked. Components that Reyes knew from experience could be finicky, could require adjustment and readjustment, seemed to leap into the old man's hands and find their homes without resistance. It was like watching a magic trick performed in reverse, like watching scattered pieces remember they had once been whole and rushing to reunite. 40 seconds. The upper and lower receivers came together with a solid click that resonated through the room like a period at the end of a sentence. The old man's hands performed the final connections, the takedown pins sliding into place with twin snaps that sounded almost like applause. And then he stopped. His hands came to rest on either side of the completed rifle. For a moment, he simply stood there, looking down at what he had built. His chest rose and fell with steady breaths. His face showed nothing, revealed nothing, but his eyes held something that might have been grief, or might have been peace, or might have been both at once. He looked up at Vance. Vance looked down at his timer. 47 seconds. The number glowed on the screen like an accusation. 47 seconds. 13 seconds faster than the time Vance had demanded. 13 seconds faster than the standard that first attempt recruits were expected to meet. And the old man had done it with hands that should have been too weathered, too worn, too old to move with that kind of precision. Nobody spoke. The rain had softened outside, settling into a gentle patter against the windows, but inside the recruiting station the silence was absolute. The two recruits sat frozen in their plastic chairs. Chen stood motionless in the middle of the room. Reyes had her phone raised now, though she could not remember lifting it, and the red recording light blinked steadily in the corner of the screen. The old man reached down and performed a functions check. His movements were smooth and automatic. He pulled the charging handle, checked the chamber, tested the trigger with a dry click that seemed to echo in the silence. The rifle worked. Of course it worked. It had been assembled by hands that had built 10,000 rifles before it, hands that knew this weapon the way a pianist knows a keyboard, the way a surgeon knows a scalpel. 47 seconds, the old man said quietly. He did not look at Vance. He did not need to. His voice carried the weight of everything he had proven without saying another word. When I was teaching, I could do it in 31. But that was a long time ago. He finally raised his eyes to meet the sergeant's stunned gaze. I suppose I have gotten slow. Vance stood with his phone still raised, the timer frozen at 47 seconds, his face cycling through expressions like a slot machine that could not find a winning combination. Confusion gave way to disbelief, disbelief to denial, denial to something that looked almost like fear. His mouth opened and closed twice before any sound emerged. That does not prove anything, he finally managed. His voice had lost its theatrical projection. It came out thin and uncertain, the voice of a man grasping for solid ground that had suddenly turned to sand beneath his feet. Speed is not the same as authenticity. Anyone can practice. Anyone can learn a party trick. But even as he spoke the words, he knew they rang hollow. This had not been a party trick. This had not been practice. What he had just witnessed was something else entirely, something that existed on a level he had never encountered in his 3 years of service. The old man's hands had not performed an assembly. They had conducted a ritual, executed a ceremony, spoken a language that Vance did not even know existed. Staff Sergeant Chen finally moved. He crossed the room slowly, his eyes never leaving the completed rifle on the table, and stopped beside Vance with an expression that mixed wonder with something that looked almost like anger. That grip sequence, Chen said quietly. His voice was barely above a whisper, but in the silence of the room, it carried to every corner. I have seen that grip sequence before. Only once. At instructor qualification school. They showed us archived training footage from the 70s. He turned to look at the old man, and there was something new in his gaze. Something that bordered on reverence. They told us it was developed by a master armorer, someone who spent 30 years perfecting techniques that are still taught today. They called it the Tatum sequence. The name landed in the room like a grenade with the pin pulled. Reyes lowered her phone slowly, her hand trembling. The Tatum sequence. She had heard that name before. Every Marine who had gone through weapons training had heard that name, though most assumed it referred to some historical figure for generations past, someone who had died long before they were born. The idea that the Tatum in question might be standing in front of her, dripping rainwater onto the floor of a strip mall recruiting station, seemed impossible. It seemed like being told that the person who invented the wheel had just walked in to ask for directions. The old man said nothing. He stood beside the table with his hands at his sides, watching the reactions ripple through the room like waves spreading from stone dropped into still water. His face remained impassive, but something had shifted in his posture. The straightening that had begun earlier was complete now. He stood like what he had always been, what 7 years of streets and grief and self-imposed exile had not been able to erase. The recruit in the community college sweatshirt had given up any pretense of staying for the presentation. He stood from his chair and backed toward the door, his eyes wide, his phone clutched in his hand. His companion in the football jacket remained seated, but his earlier entertainment had transformed into something else entirely. He looked at the old man the way someone might look at a monument that had suddenly come to life. Vance was shaking his head now, a continuous small motion of denial. "No," he said. "No, that is not possible. The Tatum sequence is named after someone who retired decades ago. Someone who would have to be in his 70s by now." He gestured at the old man with a hand that was not entirely steady. "This is just some homeless guy who learned a few tricks. This does not mean anything." "I am 74, the old man said. His voice was calm, almost gentle, the voice of someone correcting a minor misunderstanding. "I retired from active instruction in 2003. I spent 4 more years consulting before my wife got sick." He paused, and something flickered across his face, there and gone like lightning. "After she passed, I did not see much point in continuing." Chen had pulled out his own phone and was typing rapidly, searching for something. After a moment, he stopped. His face went pale. He turned the screen toward Vance, toward Reyes, toward anyone who would look. The image on the screen showed a younger man in marine dress blues, standing at attention beside a display of training commendations. The face was leaner, the hair darker, the posture sharp as a blade. But the eyes were the same, gray and steady and carrying the weight of everything they'd seen. "Master Gunnery Sergeant Elwood Tatum." Chen read from the caption beneath the image. "Huit Bataillon, Marine Corps Base Quantico. Recipient of the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal, the Meritorious Service Medal, and the Marine Corps Instructor of the Year Award 6 times between 1985 and 2001. Developer of the Tatum sequence. Still considered the standard for advanced weapons assembly and maintenance instruction." The silence that followed was so complete that Reyes could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. Vance stared at the image on Chen's phone. Then he looked at the old man, then back at the image. His mouth worked soundlessly, trying to form words that would not come. The confident sergeant who had spent the last 20 minutes mocking and belittling a homeless man had vanished entirely. In his place stood someone much smaller, someone who had just realized the magnitude of what he had done. The old man watched him without expression. There was no triumph in his eyes, no satisfaction at the reversal. There was only a kind of tired patience, the patience of someone who had learned long ago that recognition and respect were ephemeral things, here one moment and gone the next. He had not assembled that rifle to prove anything. He had assembled it because his hands remembered, because his body knew what his mind had tried to forget, because some parts of who we are cannot be erased, no matter how hard we try to walk away from them. "I told you," the old man said quietly. "I just wanted to wait out the storm." And at that moment, the front door of the recruiting station swung open, and an older man in a rain-spotted jacket stepped through, shaking water from his shoulders and carrying a cardboard box under one arm. The man who entered was somewhere in his early 70s, with close-cropped gray hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent significant time outdoors in difficult conditions. He wore civilian clothes, but there was something in the way he carried himself that marked him as clearly as any uniform would have. His shoulders were squared, his spine straight, his movements economical and precise. He was a Marine. Anyone who had ever served would have recognized it instantly. He stopped just inside the door, blinking water from his eyes and taking in the scene before him. The frozen tableau of the recruiting station. The young sergeant standing pale and stricken beside the demonstration table. The staff sergeant holding a phone with an image that seemed to have drained the blood from everyone's face. The young lance corporal with her own phone raised, red recording light still blinking. The 2 recruits pressed back against the wall like witnesses to an accident. And the old man, standing beside the table with a completed rifle before him, rainwater still darkening his worn clothes, gray eyes fixed on nothing in particular. The newcomer set his cardboard box on the nearest chair. "I'm looking for Staff Sergeant Shun," he said. His voice carried the rough edge of age, but remained strong, the voice of someone accustomed to being heard. "I called earlier about donating some memorabilia. Vietnam-era items. I thought they might be useful for recruitment displays." Shun did not respond. He seemed incapable of response, still staring at the image on his phone as if hoping it might change into something less impossible. The newcomer's eyes swept the room again, trying to make sense of the strange atmosphere. His gaze passed over Vance, over Reyes, over the recruits, and finally settled on the old man by the table. He looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the rifle, then back at the old man. Something changed in his face. It was subtle at first, a slight narrowing of the eyes, a tension in the jaw, the expression of someone trying to place a familiar melody heard from a great distance. He took a step forward, then another, his attention now fixed entirely on the old man's hands where they rested at his sides. "That grip," the newcomer said slowly. His voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "I know that grip, the way the fingers curl, the positioning of the thumb." He took another step. His eyes moved from the hands to the face, studying the lines and weathering in years that had accumulated there, searching for something beneath the surface, searching for a memory. The old man met his gaze. For a moment, neither of them moved. Two men in their 70s, standing in a recruiting station while the rain tapped against the windows, separated by 50 years and whatever distance life had put between them. "Quantico," the newcomer said. "1972, I was fresh out of boot camp, scared out of my mind. They assigned me to weapons familiarization with some instructor everyone said was the best in the Corps." He shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving the old man's face. "He had a nickname, something about his hands, something about the way they moved." "Iron Hand," Staff Sergeant Shun said quietly from across the room. The newcomer flinched like he had been struck. That word, that name, it hit him with physical force, and suddenly his eyes went wide, and his hand came up to cover his mouth, and his body swayed slightly, as if the floor had shifted beneath him. "Oh my God!" He breathed through his fingers. "Oh my God!" He moved forward again, faster now, closing the distance between himself and the old man until they stood only an arm's length apart. His eyes were wet. His hands were trembling. When he spoke again, his voice cracked on every word. "Master Gunnery Sergeant Tatum," he said. It came out like a prayer, like something sacred that had been waiting decades to be spoken. "I am Vernon Price. You probably do not remember me. I was just one of hundreds who came through your training. But I remember you." His voice broke entirely, and he had to pause to collect himself. "I remember everything you taught me. Your lessons saved my life more times than I can count. I named my son after you. I have told my grandchildren about you. And I thought you were dead." The old man stood very still. His face remained impassive, but something moved behind his eyes. Something that might have been recognition. Something that might have been the first crack in a wall that had been holding back 7 years of isolation. "Price," he said slowly. "Vernon Price." The name emerged from somewhere deep, dredged up from the archives of memory. "Rifle range. August. You could not hit the broadside of a barn when you started." A sound escaped from Price that was half laugh and half sob. "You made me stay late every day for 3 weeks. You said I was going to learn to shoot straight, or you were going to die of old age watching me try." The old man's lips twitched. The ghost of a smile, there and gone so quickly it might have been imagined. "You learned," he said. "I learned," Price agreed. Tears were running freely down his weathered cheeks now. He made no move to wipe them away. "Because of you. Everything I did in country, every brother I brought home, every shot I made when it mattered, that was because of you." He reached out and gripped the old man's shoulder. The touch was firm, solid, the grip of one warrior acknowledging another across the gulf of years and circumstance. "What happened to you?" Price whispered. "Where have you been? Why are you here like this?" The old man did not answer immediately. He looked down at Price's hand on his shoulder, at the human contact he had avoided for so long that he had almost forgotten what it felt like. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with something that might have been emotion or might have been the rust of years of silence. "My wife died," he said simply. and I forgot how to live without her." The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished fire. My wife died, and I forgot how to live without her. 9 words that contained 7 years of grief, 7 years of wandering, 7 years of a man trying to disappear because the alternative was facing each morning in a world that no longer held the one person who made it bearable. Price's grip on the old man's shoulder tightened. His tears had not stopped, and he seemed to have given up any attempt to control them. 50 years of respect and gratitude poured out of him in that recruiting station, witnessed by a young sergeant who had spent 20 minutes mocking the recipient of all that reverence. "Margaret," the old man said. Her name was Margaret. 42 years. She was the only person who could make me sleep through the night. The only one who knew how to quiet the noise in my head. He paused, and his jaw worked silently for a moment before he could continue. "Cancer. 11 months from diagnosis to the end. I watched her disappear one piece at a time, and when she was finally gone, I realized that the pieces she took with her were the only ones that mattered." Price nodded slowly. He understood. Every veteran in the room understood, even if they had not lived it themselves. They knew about the anchors that kept men from drifting into the dark. They knew what happened when those anchors were cut. "You have a daughter," Price said. It was not a question. "I remember you talking about her. Elena. You used to show pictures during breaks in training." "Proudest father I ever saw." Something flickered across the old man's face. Pain, raw and fresh despite the years. "Elena," he repeated. "She has her mother's eyes. Every time I looked at her after Margaret passed, I saw my wife looking back at me. I could not bear it. I thought I was protecting her by leaving. I thought my grief would only drag her down." Staff Sergeant Chun had moved closer, drawn by the gravity of the moment. Reyes had lowered her phone, but kept it recording, sensing that what was unfolding deserved to be preserved. Even the 2 recruits had stopped their slow retreat toward the door, frozen in place by the weight of what they were witnessing. Vance stood apart from all of them. His face had gone gray. His confident posture had collapsed into something hunched and small. He watched the exchange between Price and the old man with the expression of someone who had just realized they had been throwing stones at a cathedral. "Where have you been staying?" Price asked gently. "How have you been surviving?" The old man shrugged, a small motion that somehow contained multitudes. "Overpasses. Shelters when the weather gets bad. Day labor when I can find it." He looked down at his hands, at the fingers that had just assembled a rifle faster than most active-duty Marines could manage. "These still work. I load trucks, move boxes, whatever needs doing." "For 7 years," Price said. His voice cracked again. "For 7 years, one of the greatest Marines I ever knew has been loading trucks and sleeping under bridges." "I did not want to be found," the old man said simply. "I did not think I deserved to be found." The door to the back office opened, and a man in his late 50s emerged. He wore civilian clothes, but carried himself with unmistakable authority, the bearing of someone who had spent decades in command. His eyes swept the room, taking in the strange tableau, the emotional tension, the completed rifle on the table, and the 2 old men standing face to face with tears on their cheeks. "What is going on out here?" he asked. His voice was calm, but carried the expectation of an immediate answer. "Chun, report." Staff Sergeant Chun straightened automatically. "Colonel Webb, sir. We have a situation." He gestured toward the old man, struggling to find words adequate to explain. "This gentleman came in to wait out the storm." Sergeant Vance challenged him to assemble a rifle. He did it in 47 seconds using techniques I have only seen in archive training footage. He paused, then delivered the final piece of information like a soldier reporting confirmed contact. "Sir, this is Master Gunnery Sergeant Elwood Tatum, the Elwood Tatum, developer of the Tatum sequence." Colonel Webb went very still. His eyes moved to the old man, studying him with sudden intensity. Then they moved to the rifle on the table, then to Vernon Price, still gripping the old man's shoulder like a lifeline. "The Tatum sequence," Webb repeated slowly. "I learned that sequence at officer candidate school. Every Marine officer for the past 40 years has learned that sequence." He took a step forward, then another, approaching the old man with something approaching reverence in his bearing. "I studied your training methods at Quantico. I based my entire approach to weapons instruction on your principles. My drill instructor used to tell us stories about you like you were some kind of legend." He stopped in front of the old man and extended his hand. "Master Gunnery Sergeant," he said formally, "it is an honor to meet you. A genuine honor." The old man looked at the extended hand for a long moment. He had not shaken anyone's hand in 7 years, had not accepted that simple gesture of respect and connection since before Margaret died. His own hand trembled slightly as he raised it, as if the muscles had forgotten the motion. Their hands met. Webb's grip was firm and warm. The old man felt something crack inside his chest, some wall that had been holding back more than he realized. "Sir," he said quietly. The word came out rough, rusty from disuse, but it came. "It is just Tatum now. I have not been a Master Gunnery Sergeant in a long time." Webb shook his head firmly. "With respect, that is not how it works. You do not stop being what you earn just because you take off the uniform. You are a Master Gunnery Sergeant until the day you die, and probably beyond." He turned to look at Vance, and his expression hardened into something cold. "Now, someone want to tell me exactly what happened here before I arrived?" The silence that followed Colonel Webb's question was suffocating. Every eye in the room turned towards Sergeant Vance, who stood frozen beside his desk like a man facing a firing squad. His earlier confidence had evaporated so completely that he seemed physically diminished, shoulders hunched, chin tucked, the posture of someone trying to make himself smaller. Staff Sergeant Shun cleared his throat. "Sir," he began, but before he could continue, Lance Corporal Reyes stepped forward. "I have it recorded, sir," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hand trembled slightly as she held up her phone. "Everything, from when Master Gunnery Sergeant Tatum entered the station until now." Webb extended his hand, and Reyes placed the phone in it without hesitation. The colonel's face remained impassive as he watched the footage, but something tightened around his eyes. Something that looked like controlled fury building behind a dam of military discipline. The recording played in the silent room. Vance's voice emerged from the tiny speaker, loud and mocking. "This is not a homeless shelter. We are a United States Marine Corps recruiting station." The contempt in those words seemed to fill the space, bouncing off the walls, impossible to escape. Webb watched without expression as the footage continued. The insults, the accusations, the stolen valor claims, the challenge issued with theatrical arrogance. And through it all, the old man standing patient and still, responding with quiet dignity to every attack, asking for nothing but a dry place to wait out the storm. When the footage reached the rifle assembly, Webb's eyes widened slightly. He watched the old man's hands move with that impossible speed and precision, watched the components come together like they were magnetized, watched 47 seconds of mastery that made every other assembly he had ever witnessed look like fumbling. The recording ended with Price's arrival and the moment of recognition. Webb lowered the phone slowly. He did not look at Vance. He did not need to. The weight of his attention was somehow worse than any direct confrontation. "Sergeant Vance," Webb said. His voice was quiet, controlled, and absolutely terrifying. "Step forward." Vance moved on trembling legs. He stopped in front of the colonel and stood at attention, though his rigid posture could not hide the shaking in his hands. "Do you know what I just watched?" Webb asked. "Sir," Vance began, his voice cracking. "I can explain. I thought he was just another homeless man trying to run a scam. I thought I was protecting the integrity of the recruiting station. I thought." "You thought," Webb interrupted. The words fell like hammer blows. "You thought." A sergeant in the United States Marine Corps thought it was appropriate to mock, belittle, and publicly humiliate a man who asked for nothing more than shelter from storm. You thought it was acceptable to accuse a veteran of stolen valor without evidence. You thought your 3 years of service gave you the right to judge someone based on their appearance. "Sir, I'm not finished," Webb said, and Vance's mouth snapped shut. "That man you mocked built the foundation you stand on. Every technique you learned, every principle you were taught about weapons maintenance and assembly traces back to his hands. Marines you have never met are alive today because of what he created. And you called him a fraud. You called him a failure. You demanded he prove himself to you. Webb finally turned to look directly at Vance, and the young sergeant flinched as if struck. Do you know what Master Gunnery Sergeant Tatum did in Vietnam? Webb continued. Do you know what earned him the nickname Iron Hand? He did not wait for an answer. He spent 2 tours training Marines in the field. Not at some comfortable base, but in country, in the jungle, under fire. He taught men to maintain their weapons while mortars fell around them. He taught men to clear jams while their brothers died beside them. And when the fighting got close enough that teaching was not an option, he picked up his own rifle and showed them what a real Marine looked like. The colonel paused, letting the weight of those words settle. He has 2 Bronze Stars, Webb said, a Purple Heart, a Navy Commendation Medal with Combat V. And that does not even account for the lives he saved through 30 years of instruction after he came home. That does not account for the Marines who went to war with his lessons in their heads and came back because of it. Vance had gone pale. His eyes were wet, though whether from shame or fear was impossible to tell. I did not know, he whispered. I did not know who he was. That is precisely the point, Webb said. His voice had lost some of its edge, but the disappointment that replaced it was somehow worse. You did not know. You looked at a man in worn clothes, a man who clearly had nothing, and you decided he deserved your contempt. You decided that his appearance told you everything you needed to know about his worth. He shook his head slowly. That is not what I expect from Marines under my command. That is not what the Corps is supposed to be. The old man had been watching this exchange in silence. Now he spoke, his rough voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Colonel, he said, with respect. Webb turned to face him, and even in his anger, there was deference in the motion. The automatic respect one warrior shows another who has earned it 10 times over. The boy made a mistake, the old man continued. He looked at me and saw what I look like. That is not entirely his fault. I have not given anyone reason to see anything else. He paused, his gray eyes moving to Vance's stricken face. I did not come here for an apology or a reckoning. I came here to get out of the rain. What happens to him is not my concern. Webb studied the old man for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. That may be, he said, but what happens to him is my concern. And there will be consequences. Not because you demand them, but because the Corps requires them. He turned back to Vance. We will discuss this further in my office. For now, you are relieved of duty for the remainder of the day. Vance opened his mouth as if to protest, then closed it. He nodded once, sharply, and stepped back. His eyes met the old man's for just a moment, and in that glance was something that might have been the beginning of understanding. The first crack in arrogance that might eventually grow into wisdom. Yes, sir, Vance said quietly, and then, turning to the old man with visible effort, Master Gunnery Sergeant. I am sorry. I know that does not fix anything, but I am sorry. The old man regarded him for a long moment. Then he nodded once, a small motion of acknowledgement that offered neither forgiveness nor condemnation, just recognition that the words had been spoken. The rain had stopped. Somewhere during the confrontation and its aftermath, the storm had exhausted itself and moved on, leaving behind wet streets and a sky that was beginning to show patches of pale afternoon blue. Light slanted through the recruiting station windows at a new angle, catching the drops still clinging to the glass and turning them into small prisms. Vernon Price had not released his grip on the old man's shoulder. He stood beside him like a guardian, like someone afraid that if he let go, the man might vanish back into the streets that had hidden him for 7 years. What happens now? Price asked quietly. The question was directed at Colonel Webb, but his eyes stayed on the old man. Where does he go from here? Webb had moved to Chin's desk and was making phone calls, his voice low and urgent. He looked up at Price's question and held up one finger, signaling for patience. His conversation continued for another minute before he ended the call and turned to face the group. I have contacted the VA, Webb said, and with several veteran support organizations in the area. We can have resources mobilized within the hour. Housing, medical care, whatever is needed. He looked at the old man with something approaching tenderness in his otherwise stern expression. Master Gunnery Sergeant, there are people who want to help. People who consider it an honor to help someone like you. Will you let them? The old man did not answer immediately. He looked around a recruiting station, at the faces watching him, at the rifle still sitting on the demonstration table, at the puddle of rainwater that had formed beneath him and was now beginning to dry at its edges. 7 years of avoiding exactly this moment. 7 years of convincing himself that he did not deserve help, did not deserve kindness, did not deserve anything but the slow erosion of days bleeding into nights, bleeding into days again. "My daughter," he said finally. His voice was rough, barely above a whisper. "Elena. She owns a bakery, 3 blocks from where I sleep most nights. I have watched her through the window. I have seen her grow her business, seen her put up decorations for holidays, seen her laugh with customers." He paused, and something cracked in his voice. "She keeps a photograph of me on the counter. A photograph and a note asking if anyone has seen me." Price's grip tightened on his shoulder. Reyes made a small sound that might have been a sob. Even Colonel Webb's stern composure flickered. "She has been looking for you," Price said. "For 7 years, she has been looking." The old man nodded slowly. "I know. I have seen the flyers she puts up. I have watched her staple them to telephone poles, tape them to windows. Every time they fade or get torn down, she puts up new ones." He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were wet. "I thought I was protecting her. I thought my grief would only hurt her. But I have been watching her hurt anyway, and I did nothing to stop it." Webb stepped forward. "Do you want to see her?" he asked. "Do you want us to contact her?" The question hung in the air like something fragile, something that might shatter if handled too roughly. The old man stood motionless, wrestling with 7 years of self-imposed exile, 7 years of believing he had nothing left to offer anyone. "I do not know if she will want to see me," he said finally. "I left her. I left her when she needed me most. After her mother died, after everything fell apart, I walked away and let her carry all of it alone." Price shook his head firmly. "You do not know that," he said. "You do not know what she wants until you give her the chance to tell you. And from what you have described, from the photographs and the flyers and the 7 years of searching, I think you might be surprised." Staff Sergeant Chun had been typing on his computer. He looked up now with an expression of barely contained emotion. "Sir," he said to Webb, "I found the bakery. Sweet Elena's, on Maple Street. There is a phone number listed." Webb looked at the old man. "The decision is yours, Master Gunnery Sergeant. No one will force you into anything. But if you want to make that call, or if you want someone to make it for you, we are here." The old man stared at the floor. His hands, those legendary hands that had assembled rifles and trained generations and built a legacy that would outlive him, trembled at his sides. The weight of the choice pressed down on him like a physical force. Then he thought of Margaret. Not the Margaret who had wasted away in a hospital bed, but the Margaret who had stood beside him for 42 years. The Margaret who had pushed him to be better, to do more, to never give up on the people who needed him. He heard her voice in his memory, clear as it had been in life. "Elwood James Tatum," she said in his mind. "You stubborn old fool. Go see your daughter." A sound escaped him that was half laugh and half sob. He looked up at Webb, at Price, at the room full of people who were waiting for him to make the hardest decision of his life. "Make the call," he said. Chen's fingers were already moving. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then a woman's voice answered, professional and warm. "Sweet Elena's Bakery. This is Elena speaking." Chun held the phone out toward the old man. His hand shook as he took it. He raised it to his ear, and for a moment he could not speak, could not force any sound past the lump at his throat. "Elena," he finally managed. His voice cracked on her name. "Baby girl, it is Dad." The silence on the other end of the line lasted exactly 2 heartbeats. Then came a sound that would stay with everyone in that recruiting station for the rest of their lives. A cry that was pain and joy and disbelief and hope all woven together into something that transcended language. "Daddy?" The word came out broken, shattered, rebuilt with every repetition. "Daddy? Where are you? Where are you? I am coming. Tell me where you are, and I am coming right now." The old man gave her the address. His voice steadied as he spoke, gaining strength from the desperation in hers, from the proof that she had not given up on him even when he had given up on himself. He had barely finished speaking when she said, "Do not move. Do not you dare move. I will be there in 5 minutes. Stay right there. Promise me." "I promise," he said. And for the first time in 7 years, a promise felt like something he could keep. He ended the call and handed the phone back to Chun. Then he looked at the door, at the sunlight now streaming through the windows, at the world that had suddenly become a different place than it had been an hour ago. "She's coming," he said. The words sounded foreign in his mouth. "Impossible. Miraculous. My daughter is coming. She made it in 4 minutes." The door of the recruiting station flew open with enough force to rattle the windows. And then she was there, standing in the entrance with flour still dusting her apron and her hair escaping from its ponytail and tears already streaming down her face. Elena Tatum was 44 years old. She had her mother's eyes, just as the old man had said, dark and deep and filled with an emotion so raw it seemed to radiate from her like heat from a fire. She stood frozen in the doorway for one eternal second, her gaze sweeping the room until it found him. "Dad," she breathed. The old man took a step toward her. His legs felt uncertain beneath him, unreliable after 7 years of walking toward nothing. But they carried him forward, one step and then another, closing the distance that he had created and maintained for so long. Elena met him halfway. She crashed into him with the force of 7 years of searching, 7 years of hoping, 7 years of refusing to believe that her father was gone forever. Her arms wrapped around him, and she buried her face against his chest, and the sound that came out of her was something between a scream and a prayer. "I found you," she sobbed. "I found you. I never stopped looking. I put up flyers every week. I walked the streets calling your name. I never stopped. I never stopped." The old man held his daughter for the first time since the day he had walked away from everything. His arms remembered the motion, even if his heart had forgotten it was possible. He held her and felt her shake against him and let his own tears fall into her hair. "I know," he whispered. "I saw them. I saw you put them up. I watched you from across the street. I was too afraid to come closer. Too ashamed." Elena pulled back just enough to look at his face. Her hands came up to cup his weathered cheeks, her thumbs tracing the lines that 7 years of hard living had carved into his skin. "You stupid, stubborn, impossible man," she said, and somehow the words sounded like a love song. "Do you have any idea what you put me through? Do you have any idea how many nights I lay awake wondering if you were alive or dead?" "I am sorry," the old man said. The words felt inadequate, too small to contain the weight of what he was apologizing for. "I thought I was protecting you. I thought you would be better off without me dragging you down." Elena shook her head fiercely. "You were wrong," she said. "You were so wrong. I needed you. After Mom died, I needed my father. And you just vanished. You left a note that said, 'Do not look for me.' And then you expected me to just accept that?" She pulled him close again, holding him like she was afraid he might disappear if she let go. "I have a son," she said against his chest. "His name is Marcus. He is 12 years old. He has never met his grandfather. I have shown him pictures. I have told him stories. But he has never met you." The old man went still. A grandson, 12 years old. A boy who had grown up hearing stories about a man who had vanished before he was old enough to form memories. "Marcus," he repeated. The name felt sacred in his mouth. "He wants to learn about the stars," Elena said. She pulled back again, smiling through her tears. "I told him you used to teach me the constellations when I was little. I told him about the astronomy book your father gave you, the one you carried through 2 wars. He has been asking about it for years." The old man's hand moved to the worn pack that hung from his shoulder, the pack that contained everything he owned in the world. His fingers found the familiar shape inside, the book that had survived Vietnam and 30 years at Quantico and 7 years on the streets. "I still have it," he said. Elena laughed, a sound bright with joy and wet with tears. "Of course you do." She took his hand in hers, the same way she had when she was a little girl, and they would walk together under the night sky, while he pointed out Orion and Cassiopeia and the bears that circled the North Star. "Come home," she said. "Please, come home." The old man looked around the recruiting station one last time. At Vernon Price, who had tears running down his face and a smile that spoke of prayers answered. At Colonel Webb, who stood at attention as if honoring something sacred. At Staff Sergeant Shun and Lance Corporal Reyes, witnesses to a moment they would carry with them forever. At the rifle still sitting on the demonstration table, assembled in 47 seconds by hands that had never forgotten what they were capable of. His eyes found Vance, standing apart from the others, his face a mask of shame and wonder and something that might have been the beginning of change. The young sergeant met his gaze and nodded once, a small acknowledgement of everything that had passed between them. The old man turned back to his daughter. He looked at her face, at her mother's eyes, and for the first time in 7 years, looking did not feel like drowning. It felt like surfacing. "Okay," he said. His voice cracked on the word, but he said it again, stronger this time. "Okay, I will come home." Elena led him toward the door, her hand never leaving his. As they stepped out into the afternoon sunlight, the old man paused on the threshold. He looked back at the room, full of people who had witnessed his lowest moment and his redemption in the same hour. "Thank you," he said. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything they had given him. A chance, a choice, a reason to believe that it was not too late. Then he stepped out into the light, and his daughter guided him home. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that second chances are possible and that the people we pass on the street might be carrying burdens we cannot imagine, please subscribe to our channel. And think about this. Who is the quiet hero in your life? Who is the person whose worth goes unrecognized, whose sacrifice goes unacknowledged? Maybe it is time to let them know they are seen. Thank you for watching. And remember, every person you meet has a story. Some of those stories might just change your life. 3 months later, Elwood Tatum sat on his daughter's back porch, a 12-year-old boy beside him, and an astronomy book open across their laps. The summer sky stretched above them, infinite and ancient, filled with the same stars he had shown Elena when she was young, the same stars he had watched from foxholes and rooftops and beneath bridges. "That one is Orion," Marcus said, pointing. "You can tell by the belt. 3 stars in a row." The old man smiled. "That is right," he said. "And do you know what those 3 stars are called?" Marcus shook his head, leaning closer to hear. "Alnitak, Alnilam, and Mintaka," the old man said. He had said those names 1,000 times before, to recruits and students and his own daughter, but they had never sounded sweeter than they did now. They are hundreds of light years away. The light we see tonight left those stars before your mother was born. Marcus looked up at him with wonder in his young face. The same wonder the old man had seen in Elena's eyes when she was small. The same wonder he had thought was lost to him forever. "Will you teach me more?" Marcus asked. "Every night?" The old man put his arm around his grandson and looked up at the stars that had guided him through darkness and into light. "Every night," he promised, "for as long as you want to learn." And this time, he knew he would keep that promise.